If you're not using the BSLib package, then you're not doing Shiny apps correctly. Maybe that's a bit of a dramatic thing to say, but I think in principle it is true. The BSLib package gives you so many great styles and components that you can use in Shiny apps that it is a shame if you're not using it. So that's why in today's video I'll show you how to build such an app using the BSLib package, and you can already see that it is a dashboard-like app that has a whole bunch of typical components like different tabs to navigate through, a sidebar that contains different filters or toggles, then you have some value boxes that just depict a couple of key values, and then you have these typical cards that group things together. All of this is something that you will need in a dashboard-like app, and the BSLib package gives you a whole bunch of these kind of components, and in today's video I'll show you how to make this work, so let's dive in. Alright, let's start to build out the dashboard. I'll show you what kind of data we have, and then let's get to it to create these value boxes. Alright, let's build this app. For that I've prepared a little skeleton code for you. Basically this part here is just an empty Shiny app, and here I got a data set that we want to use for this. It is the pizza place data set from the GT package, which has a whole bunch of information on pizza that was sold by some fictitious pizza place. And here really all I did was to get rid of this date and time column and instead replaced it by a date sold column that is actually of type date. That's all I've done, and this data set is the one we're going to use to build this app. So right now if we execute this, it is just an empty app, so that's pretty boring. So let's start building out this thing. What BSLib allows you to do is to not only use a page fluid, it also allows you to use other pages. And for that, if you use page underscore, you see a whole bunch of pages. The one I'm focusing on in this video will be page navbar and page sidebar. Let's start out with navbar, and in there we can specify a title. Let's call it my BSLib app. And now if we re-execute this, we see now that we have a navbar at the top, and if we make this larger, then we see that we have one bar at the top which isn't currently filled with anything, so clearly nothing can be shown. Let's fix that. To do so, we can specify our first nav panel using the nav panel function, and in there we can specify a title. Let's call this stats, and then let's specify another panel. Let's call this other stuff. And while we're at it, let's fill this other panel with some generic text. Here is where your content could live. Fascinating. Great text. And now if we re-execute everything, we see now that our menu here is filled with stuff, namely the two titles that we've just specified. And if we look into the other stuff, we see here that this actually has some content. And on full screen, or if I make this a little bit larger, you see that this actually now is side by side, and we don't have this burger menu at the top right corner. We can toggle through things immediately. Cool. So now we can fill our stats panel with the stuff that we actually want to see inside of our app. And there, the first thing I want to stick in there is a sidebar page, because we have seen that we also want to have a sidebar on this page. So let's use this function page sidebar to stick a sidebar into our page. And for that, there is this sidebar function available to us. Here, I don't want to do anything too fancy. So let's just fill this sidebar with a slider input, and let's give it an ID, a title, and fill the specific arguments using our pizza data. And finally, we can specify the width of our slider and match that with the sidebar so that it doesn't fill the complete sidebar and leave some space. And now if we re-execute this, we see now that we have a sidebar that we can toggle. That's the magic of BSLib. And also we have a slider input that we can drag. So that's pretty neat, but right now the main content of our page is empty. So let's fill it with some value boxes. What I want to have in my main content is in the first row two value boxes next to each other, but I also want to make sure that the value boxes will move below each other if the screen gets too small. So for example, if I have a very narrow screen, then the value boxes should go below each other. So that's why I will stick into the main content of my page sidebar the layout column wrap function, and in there I can now specify elements that I want to place in there. They will be put into the same row, but as things get too small, they will be put on top of each other. So that's pretty neat. And if we want to create value boxes, BSLib allows us to create a value box by the function of the same name. So here we can give it a title. In this case, I want to have the first value box specify how many pizzas we sold in our time frame. We're going to specify the value of that box via a text output that we render later on. We just make make sure that everything is in line to make things look okay. And then we also add a showcase, which is a way to add an icon to the left side of the value box, which I always think looks kind of nice. And then we can do the exact same thing for another value box, but here we're going to use revenue generated title. We're going to use a number revenue generated ID. And for the icon, I don't want to have a pizza slice. Instead, I want to have a sack of dollars. So now if I re-execute this, we see now that we do have value boxes and we do have the icons. But as I look at this full screen, the value boxes now fill the whole page. This is typically not what I want. And this is something the value boxes do. They fill available space, but this can get wonky really fast if you work with different screen sizes. So I try to minimize the things that can go wrong with this. And the way to fix that is to tell my layout column rep to not fill everything, use a specific width for the elements. And here I'm using min height so that the layout column rep knows to not make the value boxes too tiny so that the icon can still be displayed nicely. So with these changes now attached to it, we see that we have proper value boxes and they don't fill the full screen. They are still only at the top of my main page. And now the nice thing is that as I make this smaller, we see that things move on top of each other. And really, once again, this is the magic of the layout column wrap function. All right, so now you understand how to create the value boxes, but they are still empty, which isn't nice. So we should probably render something on the server side to get some values into these value boxes, and there we'll combine the scales package with what Shiny already gives you. We scroll down to our server, we can specify the output for the ID numbers pizza sold, and in there we can stick in a render text function and render the text that we want to display for this particular item. Here we could just take our df pizza, pull one of the columns. For example, there is the price column inside of this data set, and then we could check, okay, what's the length of this? And then to format this nicely, we can pass this to the scales package where we use the number function to make it into nicely formatted numbers. And now if I re-execute this, it will tell us it cannot find the function pull. And of course, either I have to load the dplyr package or I specify that I use pull from that package. So let's do that again. And now we see that we have a number in there. And I don't like that for the big mark it uses a white space here. So let's specify that the big mark should be a comma. And now things look a little bit nicer. But you might have realized that we don't actually use the time frame here. If I change this, the value doesn't update at all. And that's because we always use the full data set. That's not what we want to do. So let's create a reactive that updates on the time frame. And then we use this filtered reactive inside of this render text function to make things update. So inside of our server, let's create a new variable that we call df filtered pizza. It will be a reactive. And to compute this reactive, we just take our initial data set, pass it to the filter function, and specify that the date sold column should be larger than the smallest value that was selected with the slider input, so the left toggle. And then the same thing should be true with the second toggle. But of course, there we want to check that the date sold is less or equal than this time point. And once we have that, we can use this data set here, but make sure to use these parentheses to actually call the reactive to get the current value. So now if we re-execute this, we see that as we update the time frame, the value also updates. So with that, we have a blueprint for the value box, and we can repeat the same thing for the other value box, namely the one for the number generated. So let's stick in this ID in here. And instead of calculating the length of the price column, we of course need the sum of the price column to calculate what our revenue is. And then we don't want to format just like a regular number. We want to format it like a dollar number. So that's where the scales package comes in handy, because it has all of these formatting functions for texts. And here it comes in handy to format our output immediately like a nice little dollar amount. Well, it is not actually a little dollar amount. It's actually quite a lot of money, but you know what I mean. This is a nicely formatted text right there. And the scales dollar function did everything for us. All right, so let's recap. We have used a couple of pages and value boxes from BSLib already, and it helped us a bunch to make our things look nice and get a general layout going. But now we also want to have these card-like elements, and for that the BSLib package also has a function that makes it really easy. You see in our user interface, below the layout column wrap, we can stick in a card. And by sticking in a card, I mean using a card function. And this one can be filled with a card header function that specifies basically the title of a card. In this case, let's just call it revenue by month. And then we also specify a card body, that is the content of the card. And here we specify a plot output that is called plot by month. So now if we execute this, we see that we have a new card here. And just like the value boxes did before, it immediately fills the whole available space. We didn't have to actually do anything for this. If we wanted to, we can also make sure that our card can use full screen. Let's check out what this does. So now if we look at this, it looks exactly the same, but there's one tiny little thing that is different, and that is this small little button on the card that allows us to expand the card into full screen. That's neat, but right now it's boring because it is completely empty, but still this full screen functionality is kind of cool because it allows users to see things in more details because it temporarily makes this card full screen. So now that we've understood the structure of basic cards, let's do cool cards. There's a whole lot of stuff that cards can do, and one of the things that I like to use with cards is to use different tabs in the same card. And for that, we can use not the card function, but the navset card tab function. It allows us, just like we did with the page navbar, to specify nav panels. So in this function, we just stick in the nav panel function and say, okay, title of one tab is revenue by week. In there, we stick a card that has only a body and a plot output and can be made full screen again. Technically, you could also throw in a card title again, but here I don't want that because I want to treat this like my card title. And then we could throw in another panel using nav panel again, doing revenue by quarter instead of by week. And in there, we do the exact same thing again, sticking in a card that can be made full screen, and in its body, it just has a plot output using a different ID, of course. So if we take a look at this, then we immediately see that our previous card got smaller, fills less available space because there is something else there, and therefore there is less available space. And if we look at this in full screen, then we see now that we here have a bar that we can tap. And once again, all of these cards here are able to go full screen. And this works because we have used the card inside this nav panel here. Technically, you could just throw in this plot output into the nav panel. This is totally fine. Then you don't have a border inside of your tapped card. But I really wanted this full screen functionality, so that's why I've used this card here again. In any case, I also want to make my bar here with the tabs a little bit nicer. I want to have on the right side of the card, I want to have a button that I can click or some other UI element. Here I'm just using a button or technically an action link to trigger something. And the way to make this work, to get a clickable thing on the right and leaving some space in between, is to use the so-called nav spacer function. And then you can use a nav item to specify the item that you want to place there. And here I want to use an action link, which is just a button that is called settings, and it uses this gear icon as a symbol. And if I execute this, we then see that I have a button on the right here. So as you can see, these cards give you a whole lot of functionality of what you want to nest into it. So now what's left to do is to fill the card with some actual content. And for that, I've created a little helper function that can plot stuff for us. And I'll just copy in this function here, takes a data set and a time frame name like month, quarter, or week. And then it creates a bar chart for this using ggplot. So we also have to make sure that we call ggplot. And then we can just use this function. And here I'm just providing you with the code because plotting isn't really part of this video. So this is why we can skip a few steps and just use this helper here. And then inside of our server function, we can render the plot by month output using the render plot function, where we make sure that the filtered reactive is already available. But once that is there, we can just create the plot by taking our data set, passing it to the plot revenue by time frame function that we've just seen, and in there specify that we want to use a month time frame. And once we have this plot, we can actually return this. And now we execute this. We see that we get a nice little plot in here. It's already formatted with some nice dollar amounts because I wanted to have a nice output. All of this happens in the plot revenue function. But one thing that doesn't happen there is the formatting for the breaks of the bars. Here I don't want to have like 12.5 as a month label. So let's specify with scale x continues the breaks of this plot. And now if we redo this, it looks much better. And now we can repeat this code chunk for the other charts as well. So let's do that. Here we have to use week instead of month. We have to specify that in the plot function as well. And then we can do the same thing for for the quarter and do this here as well. Of course, the breaks for the weeks will be different. It should be something between 1 and 53. And for the quarters, it should be something between 1 and 4. And now if we rerun everything and go full screen, then we see that we have built our cards with the plot, and we can even tab through this here and we see all the results on a different aggregation level. And if we filter using our time frame here, we see that all the charts update. Finally, the one thing that is missing is that our settings button doesn't actually do anything. So let's put an observer onto the server function to change that. So let's call observe. Let's bind it to the event input button settings. And in here, I just want to show some notification, but I want to do that in style. So let's use from the Shiny Widgets package the show alert function, which creates very fancy alerts. And there we specify a title saying, hooray, you've clicked something. And of course, it is a success message. And in order for this function to work on our UI, we actually have to say that these alerts should be able to work. And for that, we just go into our UI somewhere and use from the Shiny Widgets package one of the use function, namely the one for sweet alerts. It's only important that this function is called anywhere in the UI, and then this nice little alerts work. And now if we look at this full screen, click on the settings, we say that, hooray, we've clicked something. Fantastic. With that, we have a good overview of what the BSLib package can do for you. There's a whole bunch of more stuff that BSLib will help you with, but for now, I think this is a good start. Feel free to let me know in the comments which one was your favorite component and what you might want to see next. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment about that as well. And now, with all of that said, I say thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.